In this video, I offer a formal definition of a hypothesis, distinguish it from theories and thesis statements, and offer suggestions on how to write one. A hypothesis is a specific, testable, falsifiable statement that describes a relationship between variables. Annoyingly, each of these words is an important part of the definition. Let's start at the end because this is the most common mistake students make in writing hypotheses. A hypothesis needs to describe a relationship between variables. This means that the sentence you write needs to describe two variables, a proposed cause and effect, as well as how you think they relate to each other. So, for example, the first hypothesis here isn't going to work because there are just too many things going on. It's unclear which relationship the student wants to actually test and what that actual relationship is. In the second hypothesis, I have chosen a cause and effect and described how they relate to each other. As oil exports increase, alliances increase. You'll be looking at alternate explanations in your research, but as control variables. We are going to try and examine which factor has the most explanatory value in a world where they all matter. In other words, for this project, you need to choose a specific cause and effect. This also points to the second key element of a hypothesis. It needs to be specific and testable. You don't need to define every aspect of your variables, but you do need to be relatively specific. So what does international standing or Iranian politics actually mean to you? You get to choose how you define your terms, but you do need to start the process here, and you need to think of ways you could actually observe those variables. Here, intervention in madrasas is still a bit vague, but it does start you on a path to being able to identify how you would actually figure out that the government is interfering. I've also chosen a measurable way to evaluate religious practice, mosque attendance. Ultimately, no matter what type of research you do, qualitative or quantitative, you still need to be able to define what you're actually studying and how you're going to know whether that's present or absent. Finally, a hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. I find it easiest to demonstrate this point by highlighting the difference between a hypothesis and a thesis statement. A thesis statement is a sentence that summarizes an argument. You spend an essay describing the elements of that argument and selecting credible pieces of evidence that support it. A hypothesis needs to have a clear way to be proven wrong. The purpose of your research paper is not to find evidence to support what you think is right, but to identify the potential causes of an effect and test which one has the most support. So in this example, it would be hard to prove the statement, economic development leads to democracy, wrong, because there are so many things that statement could mean. Different types of development, different types of democracy, etc. The hypothesis, as a country's GDP per capita increases, its Freedom House score increases, makes it clear what your criteria for evaluating that statement are. You've defined your terms, the relationship between them, and it's possible that this relationship is actually wrong. There's still so much more to do to actually explain the relationship between development and democracy as a whole, but scientific research helps with this by breaking that relationship down into parts and evaluating those specific testifiable parts. Another way to think about this is to think about the difference between a research question, a theory, and a hypothesis. A research question identifies a causal relationship you're interested in, such as why people protest. A theory is a proposed answer to that question. People protest because there's a gap between their economic expectations, based on their education, and their economic reality, a lack of jobs. A hypothesis is a way to test that theory. For example, as the unemployment rate for university graduates in a country increases, the number of political protests increases. This is not the only way to look at the relationship between education, economic opportunity, and protest, but it is more specific and defined. It's one you can actually test. And that's what we're going for here. You will note that all the hypotheses I have suggested follow a certain format. As one variable changes, another variable changes. This is what I recommend you do because it forces you to be clear on what your variables are, as well as what the relationship between those two variables is. We often think of a hypothesis as an if-then statement, and it's fine if you want to use this format. The only reason I don't recommend it is because it tends to require binary variables. If means something happens or doesn't happen, and it implies a deterministic relationship. That means that if one thing happens, then another thing always happens. This can be true for biology or chemistry, but it's almost never true in political science. The last thing I'm going to comment on is that in actual political science, you rarely see hypotheses written this way. Even when authors are clear about what their hypothesis is, they often write it as more of a thesis statement. I encourage you to write as statements, not because they are the only way to write hypotheses, but because they are very clear. They push you to think through variables and relationships, but obviously they're not the only way to describe a relationship between variables. Basically, I'm encouraging you to learn the formal rules and structure first, then start relaxing those rules. And just FYI, the only actual hypothesis here is the one labeled H1 in the article by Dono. So that's it on writing hypotheses. In class, we are going to review this, evaluate some sample hypotheses, and then practice writing them.